this proxy war could not have been ignited without domestic kindling. And that's why I think it's so important to reconcile, for Ukrainians to reconcile among themselves, to develop a common framework within which they can coexist. And by common, I don't mean the imposition of either a Galician narrative over Eastern Ukraine or a Malaros narrative over Western Ukraine. There has to be an ability for each region to express its diversity within a common Ukrainian political framework.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I'm joined today by Nicolai Petro, a full professor at the University of Rhode Island. Nicolai got his PhD from the University of Virginia in 1984 and taught at the Monterey Institute, where he founded the Center for Contemporary Russian Studies. He was a fellow of the Council of Foreign Relations, worked at the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, and monitored election results in Russia, Belarus, and Latvia in the early 1990s. Since then, he worked with many different private and public offices in Russia and did various research fellowships in the United States. He holds an honorary doctorate from Novgorod State University, and he's a member of the American Committee of U.S.-Russian Accord. Nicolai has worked for decades on Russian and Ukrainian politics. His books include Russian Foreign Policy, From Empire to Nation State, published in 1997, Crafting Democracy, How Novgorod Has Coped with Rapid Social Change, published in 2004, and in December 2022 he will publish The Tragedy of Ukraine, What Classical Greek Tragedy Can Teach Us About Conflict. Nicolai, thank you very much for joining me today.
Nice to be with you, Pascal.
Well, Nicolai, let me start by asking you maybe a personal question. You have decade-old ties to Russia and Ukraine. So what is the personal impact on you of this unfolding tragedy at the moment?
I think of it like a family tragedy, and I maybe as part of both families or part of a single family. I don't know. It's like I feel sometimes like a child who sees their parents fighting, and you don't want them to keep fighting, and you don't want them to keep hurting each other. You want them to reconcile so that the family life can return to normal. That's about the best analogy for my personal reaction to these events is.
Is part of your family actually from Russia or Ukraine, or did you only go there after you started your education?
My father's family is from the region of northern Russia, near Novgorod and Pskov. Both of my godparents are from Ukraine, and I grew up very close to them. But I only visited there. Started visiting Russia in the 1990s, and Ukraine in the 2000s.
So, and the rest of your life you've been growing up and living in the United States, right?
No, I grew up in Europe. I was born in Berlin and spent then the first 3 years in Italy. Then we moved to the United States for several years, became citizens, and then we moved back to Europe, which is where I finished high school. I finished junior high school in Frankfurt and high school in Rome, Italy. And then my parents stayed there, and I decided to come to the United States for college. because it was a country I didn't know very well.
Okay, so your connections from Russia to Ukraine to Europe and the United States, they all flow into each other. And I was wondering, I mean, you've researched Russia and Ukraine for decades. So what is your interpretation of why this war started? What do you think is this war about on, let's say, all sides?
In March, I wrote, I haven't written much about this current phase of the conflict. But in March, I wrote that it seems to me that there are at least three levels to this conflict. One is a geopolitical conflict between Russia and the West over Ukraine, into whose sphere of influence Ukraine should fall. A second conflict aspect of this conflict is a long-standing debate among intellectuals, both in Ukraine and Russia, over identity, how different actually is Ukraine from Russia? Is it part of the general Russian cultural matrix, or is it something not only different but antagonistic to it? There are all sorts of attitudes on this, both in Ukraine and in Russia, and that conflict has been going on for a very long time as well, beneath the surface. And the last conflict, which I think is the most important aspect of this conflict, is the internal struggle between Eastern and Western segments of Ukraine over who gets to determine Ukrainian identity. And this particular conflict has been going on, in my estimation, for at least 150 years. It's erupted into military conflict at least 4 times. And I guess it seems destined to continue, and that's what I call a tragedy, part of the tragedy of Ukraine. Because I still remain convinced that why do I believe it's the most important aspect of these 3 conflicts? Because if Ukrainians had been able to reconcile with each other and live together with each other's diversity, then none of these other external forces and debates would have been able to divide them. But as it is, each side within Ukraine is appealing for support to an external force, be it in Russia or in the West, and therefore is exacerbating the current conflict.
So, if you had to put your finger on what's fueling the entire situation, you would say it is actually the internal conflict between, let's call it, east and west of Ukraine, or is it the Ukrainians and the Russian-speaking Ukrainians?
Sometimes, but there are 2 long historical concentrations called Galicia in the west and Malorossia, which refers to the left bank, Ukraine, and Galicia to the 4 westernmost regions. It doesn't always include Volhynia, but sometimes it does. So those two regions of the country have different histories. They belonged for a long period of time to different empires. They have different religious expressions of their faith, and most recently, this has expressed itself also in an accentuated linguistic difference. But I, for one, don't point to that as the reason. The reason, it's not about just being able to speak one language or the other, because a lot of Ukrainians are comfortable with both languages, and that's especially true in Eastern Ukraine. In Western Ukraine, there's more of a rejection of the usage even and acknowledgement of the Russian language. But in Eastern Ukraine, they've always been comfortable with both Russian and Ukrainian. But it's more in the sense that Professor Richard Sakwa talks about the distinction between a monistic view of what the country should be, one culture, one people, united in their distinctiveness to their neighbors, versus a pluricultural identity for Ukraine, which allows for multiple cultural identities within an overarching political identity. And that is what the eastern portions of Ukraine have been struggling to have Ukraine become since independence, whereas the leading political forces in Western Ukraine have struggled to impose their version of Ukrainian identity over all of Ukraine.
Let me just ask you very quickly, was this situation already the same when Ukraine was in the Soviet Union, or did the Soviet Union completely did it change that picture?
No, I think there were elements of it, as I said, for at least 150 years. You can, in my latest book, I trace it back to debates after the Union at Pereyaslavl in the mid-17th century. But then after that, it reignited on the eve of the First World War, which led to political movements in favor of having an independent Ukraine, and the declaration of Ukrainian independence. But then it continued in the Soviet era and erupted again in 1991. At any particular point, there were many in the country that either favored total independence for the country, both from the, at that time already, the collapsing Austro-Hungarian Empire and the collapsing Russian Empire, but also a large group that saw Ukraine as, that believed that Ukraine should strive more for cultural autonomy, and that really was something that might in the long run become political autonomy, but that was not necessarily the most popular or desirable option at the time. And that's always been a dividing line, I would say, among Ukrainian intellectuals. Roughly speaking, East and West.
And now if we go to the other level that you talked about, a lot of people currently, and me included, interpret what is happening at the moment, at least at the very important level, as a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Do you share that opinion, or do you think that's not a good way of looking at what's happening on the larger scale?
It's part of the issue, which is why I mention it first, because it's the obvious point of contention. But like I said, this proxy war could not have been ignited without domestic kindling. And that's why I think it's so important to reconcile, for Ukrainians to reconcile among themselves, to develop a common framework within which they can coexist. And by common, I don't mean the imposition of either a Galician narrative over Eastern Ukraine or a Malaros narrative over Western Ukraine. There has to be an ability for each region to express its diversity within a common Ukrainian political framework. And I think that the more that we can do that, the more Ukraine is able to do that. And I know that this is commonly referred to in political science as federalism. And federalism, I would remind people, was something that was hotly debated in the early 1990s and promoted by the leader of the Ruch movement, which was popular in Western Ukraine, Vyacheslav Chernovil. He advocated two simple solutions that I think would have helped to avoid many subsequent problems. One is federalism for Ukraine, so that each region could express its diversity within a general Ukrainian national framework. And secondly, he also advocated a second body, a second elected body, a bicameral legislature, which Ukraine does not have. It's one of the few in Europe that does not allow for the expression of regional interest at the national level, which of course an upper house of parliament is designed to do. And I think that's been a drawback that many Ukrainian politicians have pointed to.
So the current form is unicameral, and it's pure representation of political interest, right? So
at the national level. So what happens is that regional elites have to essentially buy influence in Kiev through whatever interest they can manage to lobby for, and this has been sadly the pattern of Ukrainian politics, which has led to so many accusations of corruption.
Now, when you say that the Ukrainians need to find a way to live together in their one country, I can hear already people saying, but Russia won't let that happen. Russia is trying to eradicate Ukraine. Russia is trying to completely do away with the entire concept of an independent Ukraine. Do you view that as something that Russia is trying to do, or is that just overblown?
There is nothing in the official statements of Russian officials that suggests that. That may be personal views, and we can guess at the psychology of Russian leaders, but officially, and this includes the statements that are often cited by Vladimir Putin that these are two people. I'm sorry, these are one people. But what they forget to point out is that he immediately adds that he recognizes the existence of two independent countries. Nevertheless, what binds them should be more important. So he's clearly referring to a cultural and spiritual unity. Moreover, I'm not an expert on military affairs, but it seems to me that this military campaign has not been conducted to eliminate Ukraine. It's been conducted in order to pressure Ukraine to concede certain regions to Russia and to force a change in policy specifically toward those regions of the East. Because if it were aimed at eliminating Ukraine, then the current strategy that we've had for, what do we have now, 8 months, just makes no sense. So it seems to me that's illogical to say that's the objective when the objective is clearly something else, or at least not the extermination of the Ukrainian state.
I agree to that because we also have the fact that for 8 years the strategy of Russia has not been to absorb the eastern parts of Ukraine, but to keep them inside Ukraine and go through with the Minsk Accords.
Exactly. That was the objective of the Minsk Accords, with the notable exception of Crimea, which is in many respects a historical anomaly, regardless of the legality or illegality of the annexation. It was always recognized in Ukraine by Ukrainian politicians as a historical anomaly. And when the Commonwealth of Independent States was set up, the first president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, indicated privately, I should say subsequently, that he would have been willing to negotiate the status of Crimea, but Yeltsin never asked.
All the mistakes. Let me ask you about 2014, because a lot of things happened in January and February, and it strikes me as this starting point of the intense part of the tragedy that commenced, right? Although the groundwork has been there for like 150 years, as you say, but in 2014 something really blew up. So some people in the West interpret what happened in 2014 as the people who stood up against a corrupt regime of Viktor Yanukovych and threw him out, people's power, like out with a dictator, in with a democracy, right? Which seems to me kind of a weird way of looking what happened. And other parts, especially from Russia, the Kremlin even today represents this as a coup d'etat against the democratically elected president at the time. Can you take us back to 2014 and tell us what we know and don't know today about the Euromaidan in 2014?
Well, it seemed obvious at the time, and I think the judgment of history has confirmed that it was both. It was both an uprising of especially one region of the country, the West, the Western regions, which overwhelmingly predominated in the Maidan, in the people who came to the Maidan and set up long-term organized protests, and that later these protests came to be armed, largely, again, from the Western regions of the country. And in the East, the entire movement and its outcome was consistently viewed as having the potential for unrest and eventually leading to the illegal overthrow of the elected president, Viktor Yanukovych. And the thing that most galls the eastern portion of the country is that an agreement on a peaceful transition of power from Yanukovych to the political opposition at the time was negotiated in February 21st. But then the more radical elements on the Maidan stormed the parliament and took it over and simply started to issue its own decrees. And this action, which is hard not to call simply a coup, it was even designated at the time by one leading think tank as a classical coup. This was embraced and endorsed by the West, by the Western powers, who had literally the day before negotiated a transition of power. And this in particular is hard for Russia to swallow, as it participated in these negotiations and events, although its representative, Vladimir Lukin, the former Russian ambassador to the United States, did not sign the final agreement, saying there's no mechanism for implementing it. and these are just empty declarations. But at the same time, in the East, they too were upset with this outcome, and it led to movements regionally to assume regional control over of political institutions, I should say. And here we see the breakdown of unity in the East, because for some regions, in certain regions, they wanted to reverse what had happened in what they deemed an illegal coup in Kiev, and that particularly applies to the Donetsk and Lugansk oblast. Other regions simply were not united in this in the rest of eastern Ukraine, and in Crimea, the situation again was very different, because they had roughly 20,000 local Russian forces already there, based there under the Black Sea Fleet Agreement since the end of the Soviet Union. And the local government, which assumed full political control after February of 2014, could rely on their support. And that's exactly what they did, and first declaring that they would hold a referendum, then holding this referendum, which was initially for separation from Ukraine, and then secondarily for joining Russia proper. And all of that was compressed because of the instability and uncertainty that existed throughout Ukraine at the time. Donbass, so the regions of Donetsk and Lugansk, wanted very much, hoped for, I should say, the same outcome, but not so much the Ukrainian military, but the volunteer battalions that had supported the Maidan were a battle-ready cohort that was ready to fight, and did, in fact, initiate the conflict in the east, and then later to which the Ukrainian armed forces joined over the course of 2014. And only after two decisive losses was a stalemate achieved in the east.
So, Nicolai, the referendums that happened then since the war started in these four oblasts in the east, they came, apparently an overwhelming majority of people there voted in favor of joining the Russian Federation. Do you believe those referendums? Is there anything to them, or is it pure? Is it just a sham show?
I feel that referenda and surveys done in the heat of battle are always meaningless, which is why last June, my friend and colleague Gil Doctorow and I suggested as a possible way out holding a referendum after a prolonged cooling off period. So first stop the fighting, then have some sort of international administration of the demarcation line, and allowing each side to administer for a period of 5, 10, 15 years, whatever they agree to subsequently hold a referendum on where each side would like to be. There are precedents for that in the contested regions between France and Germany, Italy and the former, then Yugoslavia. That was exactly the solution taken. Let 10 years pass. Let each side, essentially to its own people, and to its neighbors, make the case that they should want to join them. Have a competition over peaceful development, if you will, and then have an internationally sponsored referendum. The obligation of both sides today would be to agree to hold such a referendum at a specific point in the future. And that way, it seems to me, you would honor the most important principle for democracy, which is asking the people themselves in the territory they're living in whose jurisdiction they would like to be under. Unfortunately, in all of this conflict, that's the last thing on people's minds.
Yes, it is, and we don't have good precedents in Europe, where also the Catalans would like to secede from Spain, and the Scots are talking about seceding from the UK, and we always see that the central authority will usually not agree, even in democratic states, to let it happen, if it's not in the constitutional setup. But let me maybe ask you...
Even the Constitution is manipulated in that sense. But there is an interesting legal assessment on the blog of a Scottish ambassador whose name I should know, but escapes me right at this moment. But I will get it up in a second. Anyway, he has done an interesting and thorough analysis of he's done a very interesting, thorough analysis of the status of the Scottish referendum and the decision of the International Court of Justice regarding the Kosovo precedent. So the International Court of Justice reversed its long-standing tradition of giving preference to national states over the interests of regions, and said that there is no prohibition on regions declaring their independence from the nation state. And the disagreement of the mother nation, the original nation state to which they belong, cannot be considered a prohibition on such declaration. Now, he's using this specifically to favor the argument for Scottish independence. I'm speaking, of course, of Craig Murray, Ambassador Craig Murray. But the same, of course, argument has been made by Russian authorities and Crimean authorities with respect to Crimea, that it cannot simply suffice for anything in Ukrainian law to deny any region of Ukraine, including Crimea, the right to its own self-determination, if it so chooses.
Let me ask you a last question on this segment, and then we move on. And that's about, Ukraine had until 2014 a neutrality clause in its constitution, or a clause that says Ukraine aspires to be neutral. And to me, studying this conflict, especially from the outside, it seems as if though a neutrality for Ukraine would have been the obvious solution to make sure that this war never becomes a reality. And we know today from thinkers in the US, from Chomsky to Kissinger, from left to right, a lot of people who argued that Ukraine is the obvious Austria of the 21st century that should just be neutralized, and everybody should agree it's a neutral no man's land. How do you see that issue, and why do you think that this solution didn't emerge? I mean, it went away in 2014. The article was stricken out, and Ukraine has never been further away from neutrality than now.
Well, I would argue with you that neutrality, in retrospect, was a success, because as long as that identity and aspiration was affirmed, Ukraine had the ability to pursue its own foreign policy and its own domestic policy. It was successful and was not invaded. So it was indeed as successful as Finnish and Austrian neutrality in obtaining those objectives. But the problem is, suppose the national leaders change their mind. There's nothing prohibiting them from doing so. And of course, the problems then arise because it changes the overall balance of power in the region, and which Russia deems to be a threat, and there's no way or incentive for Ukraine itself and its neighbors to be able to reassure Russia, because in fact the balance of forces on the ground has changed. Well, you could say that they shouldn't have made that decision. It was foolish and short-sighted, but they did. But there's another argument that I would be curious to hear your response to, which is often raised as a challenge to the overarching idea that neutrality is a blessing. How is neutrality enforced? For example, colleagues that you know would say, well, the Budapest Memorandum provided a framework within which Ukrainian neutrality was effectively to be guaranteed. And yet, when Crimea was annexed, the signatories of the Budapest Memorandum did not enforce that neutrality. So there is not a danger, but a worry on the part. There's always been a worry on the part of some in Ukraine that their neutrality is something that only they themselves are responsible for, and they are clearly not strong enough to do so by themselves. So what is the international context which would allow their neutrality to be defended as effectively as their independence would be defended within a bloc like NATO?
Well, my answer to that one would be that neutrality, when it works because it's in the interest of all parties, especially the strongest one. Why was Finland not invaded anymore after 1944? It's because the Soviet Union decided that it's in its best interest to have Finland where it is and have it be a buffer zone. Why was Switzerland not invaded for 200 years? Because everybody agreed that actually leaving it like that gives us a bit more than if we went in, because that will make everything more complicated. So the best guarantee for a neutrality is always to have it in the interest of all parties to be recognized. And sometimes that doesn't work. Belgium didn't work in the First and the Second World War, but we have tons and tons of examples when states also overrun other states that are parts of military alliances. The best example is the Warsaw Pact, which always invaded its own members. So membership in an alliance doesn't guarantee
Well, there's an important corollary to this that would have helped overall the concept of neutrality, and that is to have worked for a pan-European security framework.
Yes.
Within which all the members could have agreed that mutual respect, and including for those members that wanted neutrality, would be something that that would benefit the entire European community, which would include Russia and Ukraine. Unfortunately, a different path was chosen by the West in the 1990s, which was to push the Iron Curtain further east and continue to exclude certain states of the former Soviet Union, and therefore not address the security concerns of those states, including both Russia and Ukraine. And that was a terrible oversight of our political leadership in the West in the 1990s.
I see that too, and I interpret it as the confrontative wing of the Western foreign policy elite winning over the more reconciliatory one. Nicolai, I would like to thank you very much at this point. We will move to the second part of the interview now, but thank you very much for the first part.
Thank you.